there's a lot of information, swirling around on the internet, and people are getting sometimes really helpful and great information. Sometimes it's motivating people to move and stuff. But we've talked a little bit about it briefly, and I'd love to get your thoughts on, you and I learned how to box squat, and Louis taught a lot about like sitting back on the box and not specifically driving the knees forward. And now you're seeing more people talking about driving the knees forward. Some of powerlifting as we knew it changed because they got rid of the gear. People started to squat a little lower, and when you squat a little bit lower, your knees tend to want to pitch forward a bit. We had Ben Patrick on the show. He's a friend of ours. We've talked a lot about like the knees over toes type of stuff. What are some things that you might think are maybe a little bit off about some of that message? And what are just your kind of thoughts in general about, box squatting versus like specifically trying to drive the knees forward?
So the initial box squat wasn't a technical thing from Louis. What it was it separated the eccentric and concentric chain of the movement. So it's like, go bench press. Like if you're listening to this right now, just pause, go over to the bench press and bench press 135, touch and go, and then 135 with a 2-second pause, and tell me which one's easier or harder. That was the whole point. The point was the box separated the downward phase from the upward phase, which taught you, one, how to stay tight, but two, it also started to change your form a little bit, teaches you about lateral pressure. So when Louis would have you sit on the box, you might loosen up the vertical pressure, but the lateral pressure stays 100%, right? And so it teaches you where to stay tight. With that being said, if you look at not all the squatters, but most of the great all-time greats, so we could talk about Hack and some of these other guys. I think to be an all-time great, they're going to need to be around quite a bit longer. But if we look at, say, Don Reinhold, we look at who was the first guy to squat 1,000? I can't remember what his name was. I haven't talked about him in a while.
There was Dr. Squat.
Dr. Squat, but I think it was before David Waddington.
Oh, yeah.
Dave Waddington. If you look at Dave Waddington, Ed Cohen, Mike Bridges, so I'm trying to cover all these weight classes, and Don Reinhold, you start realizing that they don't squat with their shins coming forward. And that's where Louis initially got that idea for technique. And at least as far as I remember him talking to me about it at training and breakfast. So I started modeling my squat mostly off of Chuck because I knew Chuck was modeling it off of what Louis was telling him from Bridges and Cohen and all them guys. So if you go back and watch those dudes squat, you start seeing their shins are very vertical. And the thought process for it is to utilize more posterior chain to squat. So when people see like I'll give you an example. You see the 520 for 24 and people are like, well, that's not as deep as, say, Tom Platz did his. Well, are you measuring how far his shins go forward or how deep his actual hips are? Because if you look at it that way, it's pretty damn close. Because if your knees go forward in Louis' thought process, and really mine, it's wasted energy. Because as you go forward, you're not going deeper in the hip. So what you start to realize is that forward in some ways can be a waste of energy.
Like a sissy squat. You can keep driving your knees forward and you never come close to breaking parallel.
Exactly. So what's the point of squatting is in competition, you break parallel. Now, whether it's by this much or that much, it's still good or bad. It doesn't matter. So here's the thing. My thought process on the knees going over the toes is that it is an exercise that should be done on occasion. But in my opinion, if we look at where people's muscle imbalances are, most of the time they're anteriorly strong or at least dominant, and they're posteriorly weak. When I let my knee go over my toe, I'm basically focusing on all quad. And if it's all quad, it's a lot of lower back. Well, if I sit back and push my knees out, now my hamstrings, my glutes, my lower back, and my quads all work together in one synchronous unit. That should be mastered first before you go knees over toes. The reason that most people, when they squat vertical shank, they think it looks higher than letting the shins travel forward is because it's the most efficient way to break parallel. If I sit back and push out, then it looks almost like it's high, but it's not because there's no wasted energy. If you ever watch Chuck Vogelpohl squat, it's like fucking magic.
Yeah, when you squat, one of the objectives to, especially in powerlifting, because you mentioned you're just trying to get your hip lower than your knee, one of the objectives is to not move your knees any lower. And sometimes that's the first thing that people do. They're moving the object that they're supposed to dip down below parallel down by jamming the knees forward with the first part of that movement. So you really want to sit back so that knee stays nice and high.
In reality, how far you sit back is how far you push out. So if I push my knees out as hard as I can, my body sits back automatically because it doesn't want to go forward.
Yeah.
But the big thing is what's the number one thing that most coaches back in the day and doctors told you was bad? Squatting. Your knees. It's going to kill your knees. Well, not if you squat with all the pressure everywhere. The problem is when you let the knee travel way too far over the toe, it puts too much shear force at one particular area, therefore causing an issue. And then people will go like, well, why would you do that? And I was like, well, Olympic lifting is different because they need to catch the bar. So this is Chuck probably squatting somewhere around 1150 at 242.
And this is a wide ass squat.
And that's super wide, but look at his shins.
Jesus Christ.
That's just, his shins stay totally straight. Now, the thing of it is, if you were to watch, say, like a Tom Platz with his knees go way over his toes, it's not any deeper at the hip. It's just wasted motion forward. So it's difficult because everybody has their opinion on it.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, here's the thing. I think it's interesting. And like I said, I think there's a lot of things that Patrick and a lot of those guys have to offer that I think some people need to listen to. But in reality, here's my thing. And maybe I'm biased because I've trained hard for a lot of years. But if it was so good at developing anything, why does Ben Patrick have no leg size?
Actually, in person,
he's got pretty good legs.
He has pretty solid legs.
See, every time I've seen him on video.
Well, he's a kind of a thin shaped guy, but his legs are pretty jacked.
So here's my thing is my legs got to be 31 and a half inches around with multiple leg fractures, and I was bedridden for fucking 2 years. That to me shows I didn't have a knee problem. My joint didn't hurt. I was fucking broke.
Yeah.
And I got my legs to grow that big. So I'm starting to wonder, like, if my knee was to go way over my toe, how did I get all that quadricep development from not doing that? So my thought process is, why not use a squat particular technique that develops everything, not just one area? So I think there are some things that he talks about. And like I said, I'm not a guru of his information, but I know he does talk a lot about glute ham raises.
Yeah, he does talk a lot about hamstrings and balancing it out, yeah.
Here's my thing. It's transfer. So here's my deal. You put me in heeled shoes, ultra narrow, and you watch how much I can fucking squat.
You'll still squat a lot.
Yeah, I just did 600 for 10 like fucking probably 6 months ago. And then put me back in my position and see what I can squat. My point is that to me, teaching those positions only makes you good. Again, we go back to the beginning, only makes you good in one way. If I were to take Ben Patrick and show him how to squat my way, he wouldn't be any good at it. I go his way, I could still squat a shitload.
I think you'd be kind of surprised though.
Maybe.
Because there's two things.
He covers a lot of ground with his training. So, the Instagram posts are only what we can see, but he does cover a lot of ground in his training.
Yeah. His oddly enough, when it comes to the knees over toes stuff, right? I don't think you'd argue that it's not beneficial to be able to develop some comfort within that position. It shouldn't be maybe the whole way you squat, the primary way you squat, especially if you're a powerlifter. If you're a powerlifter, you'd probably want to develop a way of squatting that would allow you to move the most weight possible. And squatting in that fashion probably is not going to, the way that Ben does, probably is not going to allow you to do that. But a powerlifter who does squat in that fashion, developing some of that, like let's say an outside training block when they're not working the specific squats, it's probably a decent idea. But the other thing, I think, like, Mark mentioned, he does work like GHRs and hamstrings and that type of stuff a lot. When he came in here, it's not a crazy amount of weight, especially when thinking of a powerlifter, but he came in, he deadlifted.
465.
Deadlift, I think it was 475.
Yeah.
And it was super, he's never done that before, by the way. It's not like he deadlifts, but he easily deadlifted 475.
Trap bar deadlift.
Bar deadlift. And it was pretty glute and hamstring dominant. So I get what you're saying. Someone goes too far down that rabbit hole and only just hammers that. It's the same. I think it's a similar thing to the powerlifter who just stays low bar squatting their whole training cycle year after year after year.
My point is like, if you put me in Patrick's position within reason, I'll excel at it.
Oh yeah.
Put me in the other position, I'll break a world record. I think it's being able to have transition. But what I see on the internet, and like I said, I don't study it a ton, is that it's the same positioning he's showing over and over. That's what I see. And that's where I have an issue. I say, if you squat like this, say once every 6 or 8 weeks, I'm down. I think it's a great idea. But utilizing the exact same position all the time or saying that alleviates certain issues, it, to me, is a little off. Like, I think that, really squatting is going to be dependent on a few things. It's going to be dependent on how you're built. It's going to be dependent on where your muscle weaknesses are and how much you're attacking your weaknesses. And then, like I said, you need to last a long time before you start doing advice. Meaning, I would not be standing here talking to you about squats and my positioning on it unless I lasted through fucking 4 world records and I don't have any knee problems and I'm 43.
Yeah.
That's when you start going, well, see, and that's when I start sitting back going, okay, well, last another 10 years and then tell me you have the same thought process. Because my thought process has come from many, many years of grinding at the highest level that I could possibly obtain. And I try to tell people, I'm like, look, it's all about, again, you can have a great idea, but that idea changes over time as you evolve. So how I think about things now isn't all the same as what it was 10 years ago, but a lot of it solidifies where I've been and what I've done and who I have fixed. So seeing guys like, like my 350 firemen that I train and watching them get stronger and then watch their injury rates go down. But I don't see anybody making that famous. And that's guys between 20 years old and 60.
Yeah.
And they have no injuries and we're saving them $500,000 per department. Like that's where I would think the average person would go, I want to fucking listen to this dude. But it's just not the case because it's not sexy or new or whatever. And this is the other big thing. If you look at how Ben Patrick talks about squats, it's very similar to 20 years ago what Charles Poliquin was saying.
Oh, absolutely. Bad Project family, how's it going? Now, as you guys know, we have been talking about cold therapy for a while. Mark, Andrew, and myself, we all use cold plunge XLs since we're pretty big. But the cold plunge is amazing. And there are a lot of cold therapy tools out there. Obviously, you can use your shower. But the amazing thing about the cold plunge is, number one, it doesn't take up much space in your home or your backyard. And number two, you don't need to change your water, unlike other cold therapy devices, for 6 months to a year. It filters itself. Let's not even talk about all the benefits of cold plunging, like the dopamine release, how good you feel after doing it, and just the cascade of hormones that happens after you get in some really cold water. It's crazy, and we love it. So, Andrew, how can they get it?
Absolutely. You guys got to head over to thecoldplunge.com and at checkout, enter promo code PowerProject to save $150 off your very own cold plunge. Again, thecoldplunge.com, links to them down in the description as well as the podcast show notes.
Right?
Yeah,
Charles
he references Poliquin a lot.
He does. But I'll tell you this, I was Poliquin the last 5-6 years he was alive. And after he went and did seminars with me and Eddie, he changed his mind.
Oh, in what way?
Vertical shank.
So what did he say about it? Was he talking about like, this is the way people, like, what did he mention about it?
So what he started to say was, I'll give you the prime day. We were in close to his hometown. I was doing a seminar in Colorado Springs after we went to Amsterdam and Prague and shot seminars. And me and Eddie were Poliquin was showing his Olympic style squat and me and Eddie were showing ours. We get to Colorado Springs to do the last seminar and I'm squatting and Eddie's fucking around with squatting because he's already older at that time. And I do something like 600 for 10 vertical shank, just a belt. Charles gets smashed with 275 with his knees over his toes. And he's like, man, I can't figure it out. I was like, dude, you're not using any hamstrings to squat. You're not using a fucking bit of your posterior chain. So me and Eddie showed him how to do some vertical shank squatting. He went back home, and about 4 or 5 months later, he called me and he goes, I went back to squatting the way that I used to squat. He goes, my squat just went up 75 fucking pounds. He goes, I completely changed my thought process on it.
And that was partially, though, because he started working the posterior chain, squatting vertical shin, right?
Right.
But this is where I think maybe there might be, misunderstanding of maybe what some of Ben is doing, because visually you see the knee over toe, knee over toe, knee over toe.
Right.
But in between those posts and when you go into like what he actually does with his programming, there's a lot of posterior chain. Like there's a lot of hamstring, there's a lot of glute, there's Nordics, there's a bunch of things that really dive into that posterior chain where it, let's say that thing that might be a weak link of continuing to hammer that knee over toe is equalized, counterbalanced by working that posterior
he's all
chain.
About like hip flexor and shin and all those.
And with all
things.
that stuff, I agree. Like I said, the transferability is put him in 6 different squats and see how he responds.
Yeah.
If he's not very good at 3 or 4 of them, then my opinion is don't train that way. But again, if you can put somebody that trains in multiple fashions and ways, like I said, I don't think knees over toes is a bad idea occasionally. Just like I think box squats are good occasionally, but we've all seen it. Guys that only box squat have a problem. They go to a meet, they bomb fucking out because they're not comfortable getting in the hole. But it doesn't mean the box squat's bad. It meant that it was overused for that particular person at that particular time. And that's where it becomes, what do you need at that time? And where I have a problem is I've never seen an athlete that had weak quads. I've seen athletes have weak fucking hamstrings. So although he has everything right with the accessories, why squat in a dominant way that makes those muscle groups even more dominant? That's my problem with it.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Like you may not even need knees over toes if you know how to squat in the fashion that you're talking about.
Utilize every type of squat position that you can to develop a full range of motion, to develop strength in all different capacities.
I've never had any knee injuries in any of my lifting. My right knee has like a little bit of like tendonitis, and that developed years ago, like forever ago when I was in high school playing basketball, and it just was something that would always come back. But I didn't really necessarily have to do anything to fix some of that. But when Ben came around and started talking about the backward sled drag and all that kind of stuff, I was like, you know what, I think I can still make my knee a little stronger. So I practiced a lot of what you're saying is like go upstream and downstream of the injury. Ben was talking about the shins and all that stuff. So not only do I stretch the shins a bit, but I also dig into them with some myofascial release. I train them. I train some of the muscles around the knee, and I have zero pain in the knee at the moment. So,
Hey, I know you guys enjoyed the video, so like, comment, subscribe, and head to the Power Project Discord below. Talk to y'all later.